For decades, the automotive world ran on a hierarchy that felt untouchable. If you wanted the sharpest performance machine on Earth, you looked toward Europe, Stuttgart, Maranello, the old engineering capitals that built their reputations over generations. And if you wanted luxury with speed, the answer felt even more obvious. You paid the premium, accepted the badge, and trusted that the top of the industry still belonged to the old guard. But that certainty is starting to crack, because the global performance car market is no longer moving in small steps. It is shifting under pressure, and some of the most dangerous new machines are not coming from the places the industry taught us to fear. They are coming from a completely different industrial ecosystem, one that is no longer asking for permission, no longer trying to imitate Europe, and no longer interested in being treated like a second-tier alternative. And that is exactly where the Zeekr 001 FR enters the story. This car was not built to politely join the conversation. It was built to disrupt it, to challenge the assumption that extreme performance, advanced luxury, and engineering authority must still come from legacy European names. The 001 FR is not being positioned like a niche curiosity. It arrives like a statement that the old map of automotive power is being redrawn, and some of the most feared badges in the world may no longer be as untouchable as they once seemed. Now, before anyone dismisses Zeekr as just another ambitious EV brand with a flashy product and a short attention span, that mistake needs to be shut down immediately. Zeekr is not some isolated startup trying to manufacture credibility faster than it can build real engineering depth. It sits inside one of the most strategically assembled automotive empires in the modern industry. That empire is Geely, and once you understand Geely's reach, the Zeekr 001 FR stops looking like an outsider and starts looking like a weapon built with access to some of the most valuable technical DNA in the business. This is the same industrial group that controls Volvo, a brand long associated with obsessive safety engineering, structural integrity, and disciplined chassis development. It also controls Polestar, which helped sharpen the group's electric performance instincts. Then there is Lotus, one of the most respected names in lightweight dynamics, aerodynamic efficiency, and track-focused setup philosophy. Geely also holds major stakes in Aston Martin, adding yet another layer of elite performance proximity to its network. So when people hear Zeekr and assume inexperience, they are missing the real picture. The 001 FR is not the product of a random brand trying to shock the market with horsepower. It is the output of an industrial machine that can draw from Volvo's restraint, Lotus's aggression, and Geely's enormous research and development firepower all at once. And that is what makes this car dangerous. Because once those capabilities are fused into a single product, the result is no longer just another fast EV. It becomes something much more serious, a coordinated challenge to the old performance order. And that challenge begins at the most violent level possible, the drivetrain. Because the Zeekr 001 FR does not enter this fight with a conventional electric performance setup. It does not rely on the now familiar dual-motor formula, and it does not stop at a tri-motor compromise. Instead, it goes all the way to a fully independent quad-motor architecture, one high-performance motor for each wheel. On paper, that already sounds extreme. In practice, it changes the entire logic of how power can be deployed. The front axle delivers roughly 422 horsepower. The rear axle escalates the situation dramatically, contributing around 825 horsepower on its own. Combined, the result lands at approximately 1,265 horsepower. And that number matters not just because it is absurd, but because it is being delivered in something that still carries the shape and utility of a luxury shooting brake. But here's where the story becomes more important than the spec sheet. In the EV era, producing huge power figures is no longer the hardest trick in the industry. Big numbers alone do not prove engineering greatness anymore. The real question is whether a manufacturer can control that power distributed intelligently and make it usable without turning the vehicle into a heavy, unstable missile. That is the threshold Zeekr is trying to cross with the 001 FR. This car is not chasing attention with raw output alone. It is built around the idea that each wheel can become its own controlled source of force. And once that becomes possible, the vehicle stops behaving like a normal high-horsepower EV and starts behaving like something far more calculated, far more technical, and far more dangerous to the brands that used to own this territory. But raw output is only the beginning. The real line between a spectacular EV and a genuine engineering weapon is what happens when all that force has to survive speed stress and cornering without falling apart. This is where the Zeekr 001 FR becomes much more than a horsepower headline. To keep its motors alive at extreme rotational speeds, Zeekr uses carbon fiber wrapped rotors. That detail matters more than it may sound. Once an electric motor climbs beyond roughly 20,000 revolutions per minute, centrifugal forces become brutally destructive. A conventional metal rotor can begin to deform, expand, or in the worst case, catastrophically fail. By wrapping the rotor in carbon fiber, Zeekr is effectively reinforcing the motor against the very violence its own performance demands. It is a solution borrowed from the world of high-performance engineering, where the margin for error is almost non-existent. But even that is not the true centerpiece here. The real masterpiece is what Zeekr does with torque once all four motors come alive. Its proprietary system, Zeekr Vectoring Control, turns the car from a blunt force machine into an intelligent one. Because each wheel has its own motor torque, can be adjusted at each corner of the vehicle independently, and it can happen in milliseconds. That means the car is no longer just reacting to grip. It is actively shaping the way grip is used. In a fast corner, for example, the system can push harder through the outside rear wheel while subtly braking the inside front. The effect is almost unnatural for a vehicle of this size and mass. Instead of fighting its own weight, the car can rotate toward the apex with a level of precision that makes it feel smaller, lighter, and more obedient than a 2.5-ton shooting brake has any right to feel. And then there is the move that turns engineering into theater, the tank turn. Because the motors are independently controlled, the left and right sides of the car can rotate in opposite directions, allowing the 001 FR to perform a full 360-degree spin on dry, high-grip asphalt. For most EVs, an attempt like that would threaten electronics driveline durability and software stability all at once. Here it becomes a demonstration of how deeply the system has been integrated. That is the difference Zeekr is trying to force the industry to notice. Not just that it can build something brutally fast, but that it can command that speed with software materials and control logic at a level the old guard can no longer dismiss as imitation. And once you understand that level of control, the next question becomes unavoidable. How do you keep a 1,265 horsepower electric system from cooking itself to death? Because this is where many high-performance EVs begin to reveal their limits. Delivering massive power for a few seconds is one thing. Repeating it, sustaining it, and doing it without drowning the system in heat is something else entirely. In an electric vehicle, the hidden war is not just about the motors. It is about the electronics that feed them and the thermal systems that keep the whole machine alive under abuse. That is why the inverter story matters so much. You cannot just dump battery energy straight into a motor and expect precision. The current has to be converted from DC to AC, and that job falls to the inverter. Older and less advanced EV systems rely on conventional silicon-based inverters, which tend to be heavier, hotter, and less efficient when voltage and performance demands start climbing. The Zeekr 001 FR moves past that older logic by using 800-volt silicon-carbide inverters across all four motors. That shift is not cosmetic. Silicon carbide can tolerate higher temperatures, switch faster, and waste less energy as heat. In practical terms, that means the car can process an enormous surge of electricity during violent acceleration without bleeding away precious energy through inefficiency. It is one of the key reasons the 001 FR can chase brutal performance without immediately falling into the thermal trap that punishes so many fast EVs. But Zeekr did not stop at the inverters. To deal with the deeper heat problem inside the motors themselves, it engineered a proprietary cascade oil cooling system. Most manufacturers cool the outside of the motor casing and hope that is enough. Zeekr goes much further by directing dielectric cooling oil into the motor's copper windings, attacking the heat at its source, rather than waiting for it to spread outward. That direct contact strategy can pull internal temperatures down dramatically and fast. And that matters, because once heat takes over, power becomes fiction. Software pulls performance back, response fades, and the car stops being what the spec sheet promised. The 001 FR is trying to avoid that collapse from the inside out. This is not just an EV designed to make one heroic launch. It is engineered to survive its own violence. Of course, none of that motor technology matters if the structure underneath the car cannot carry the load. And this is where the Zeekr 001 FR becomes more interesting, because its engineering story is not just about force, it is about the platform that allows that force to remain usable. The car is built on Geely's SEA architecture, but calling it a typical EV skateboard would miss the point entirely. In a lot of electric vehicles, the platform is treated like a packaging solution, a flat floor, a battery underneath, and enough rigidity to get the job done. The 001 FR is trying to be something more disciplined than that. Its battery pack is integrated directly into the floor structure, using a cell-to-pack design, turning the pack into a structural contributor rather than just dead weight carried by the chassis. That matters because torsional rigidity is one of the silent foundations of serious performance. When a chassis twists under cornering load, the suspension geometry starts to lose precision. The damper springs and tires can no longer work against a stable reference point, and the car begins to feel vague, delayed, and compromised. A rigid structure changes that completely. The 001 FR's platform is engineered to keep the body stable enough that the suspension can actually do its job, which is crucial when a 2.5-ton luxury shooting brake is expected to behave with the discipline of something much smaller and much lighter. And because the battery mass sits low in the floor, the center of gravity is pushed closer to the road, helping suppress the kind of body roll that would normally betray a vehicle of this size. That is the hidden logic beneath the madness. Zeekr is not just adding power and hoping software can save the rest. It is building a structural base strong enough to support the ambition. And without that base, everything above it, the vectoring, the acceleration, the control would feel less like a breakthrough and more like a stunt. But a rigid platform and 4 furious motors still do not automatically create a true driver's car. If Zeekr wanted the 001 FR to be taken seriously against Europe's established performance elite, it needed something more than power and structural integrity. It needed legitimacy in the one area legacy brands still use as their final line of defense chassis behavior at the limit. And that is why the Kimi Räikkönen detail matters so much. Bringing in a 2007 Formula One world champion as chief performance advisor was not just a marketing flourish. It was a signal. Zeekr understood that if this car was going to challenge the old guard on their own ground, it could not feel artificial nervous or unfinished when pushed hard. It needed steering response damping balance and braking confidence that would hold together under real performance, driving not just in a launch control demo or on a spec sheet. So the hardware had to match the ambition. At the front, the 001 FR uses massive 10-piston forged aluminum AP racing calipers. At the rear, it runs 4-piston calipers, and all of it works with enormous Brembo carbon ceramic rotors. That combination is not there for visual drama. It is there because slowing down a very heavy, very fast EV over and over again is one of the cruelest tests in performance engineering. Standard steel brakes can fade, boil fluid, and lose composure quickly when repeated high-speed stops begin stacking heat into the system. Carbon ceramics exist to resist exactly that collapse. Then there is the suspension. Instead of leaning on a more comfort-biased air suspension approach, the 001 FR goes with a much more serious performance, layout double wishbones at the front and integral link rear, and KW high-performance coilovers. More importantly, those dampers allow manual adjustment of compression and rebound, which means the car can be tuned around surface conditions, rather than locked into a one-size-fits-all compromise. That is where Kimi's role becomes more than symbolic. His input matters because a car like this does not just need grip. It needs predictability. When all 4 motors are fighting for traction near the edge, the driver has to feel that the chassis is speaking clearly, not panicking. The damping has to control weight transfer. The body has to settle quickly. The car has to stay planted enough that its violence feels usable. And that may be the most important message hidden inside this section of the car. Zeekr is not asking the world to admire 1,265 horsepower from a distance. It is trying to prove that it understands the deeper, older, more respected art of making a fast machine trustworthy when the speed becomes real. Then we arrive at one of the most misunderstood parts of modern high-performance design: aerodynamics. Because on a car like the Zeekr 001 FR, aggressive bodywork is easy to dismiss as visual theater. Big splitters, wide surfaces, sharp diffusers, oversized wings. The industry is full of cars that wear those shapes like costumes. But at the speed, This machine is trying to reach air stops being background noise and becomes a physical enemy. That is the real problem Zeekr is solving here. Once a large heavy vehicle starts pushing beyond 170 miles per hour, aerodynamic lift becomes a direct threat to confidence stability and ultimately survival. If too much air slips underneath the body, the car begins to unload itself, steering gets lighter, tire contact weakens, and the faster the car goes, the more dangerous that instability becomes. A machine with 825 horsepower at the rear axle cannot afford vague aero behavior. At that point, bad airflow is not an inconvenience, it is sabotage. So the wide-body package on the 001 FR is not there to look violent. It is there because the laws of physics demanded it. The front splitter is designed to manage the first and most critical separation of airflow forcing pressure to behave in a controlled way before it can destabilize the chassis. The side skirts help contain the flow along the body. Underneath, the flat floor and aggressive rear diffuser work together to accelerate air and reduce pressure under the car, creating the vacuum effect that helps pin the body to the road. Then the large carbon fiber rear wing adds the final balancing force at the back, pushing the rear axle into the pavement so that the car's massive power can be converted into usable traction rather than wasted in tire spin. And the material choice matters too. Zeekr uses lightweight carbon fiber for these elements, not simply because it sounds exotic, but because aero components must add control without adding unnecessary mass. That is the distinction between a genuine track-minded system and a cosmetic performance package. In other words, the 001 FR is not dressed to intimidate, it is shaped to survive speed. And that makes it far more serious than a lot of legacy performance cars that still treat aerodynamic aggression as branding first and engineering second. And yet, even with the motors, the inverters, the chassis, the brakes, and the aero all working in harmony, there is still one problem that can destroy the credibility of a high-performance EV faster than almost anything else: heat inside the battery pack. This is the dark secret of the segment. A surprising number of electric performance cars can produce astonishing numbers for a launch, a short sprint, or a carefully managed demonstration. But once the battery starts overheating under repeated abuse, software has no choice but to protect the system. Power gets cut, response gets softened, lap times begin to drift, and the car that looked like a monster on paper suddenly starts negotiating with its own temperature limits. Zeekr clearly understood that this weakness could not exist in a car like the 001 FR. At the center of the vehicle sits a 100 kilowatt-hour battery pack supplied by CATL, paired with an 800-volt electrical architecture built to support both extreme discharge and extremely fast charging. But the real point is not just voltage or capacity. It is how the pack manages thermal stress when the car is asked to deliver violence repeatedly, not once. That is where the battery design becomes critical. Instead of relying only on more conventional cooling strategies placed beneath the cells, this system uses highly efficient liquid cooling channels arranged between the individual cells themselves. That dramatically increases the cooling surface area inside the pack, which means heat can be removed more directly and more effectively while the car is under real load. And this is not some minor technical footnote. When you ask an EV to deliver well over 1,200 horsepower, the battery is dumping energy at an aggressive, punishing rate. That creates a thermal burden that can very quickly turn performance into fiction if the pack cannot stay in the right operating window. Zeekr's goal here is simple: keep the battery stable enough that the car can keep repeating what the spec sheet promises. That same 800-volt architecture also changes the recharge story. Plug the 001 FR into a high-capacity DC ultra-fast charger, and it can move from roughly 10% to 80% in around 15 minutes. That matters because it transforms the rhythm of ownership. A car like this is not supposed to disappear for hours every time it is used hard. The idea is that you can run the machine hard, stop briefly, recharge quickly, and return to doing the same thing again. And that may be one of the most important signals the 001 FR sends to the market. It is not trying to be a one-shot electric spectacle. It is trying to prove that extreme EV performance can be repeatable, recoverable, and operationally serious, which is exactly the standard the old guard once used to separate true engineering from simple headline chasing. And after all that brutality, the Zeekr 001 FR delivers one more surprise. It refuses to behave like a stripped-out engineering experiment. Because this car is not trying to win by being a bare metal track special with no daily usability, no digital intelligence, and no sense of modern luxury. It is trying to prove something far more disruptive, that the future high-performance benchmark may belong to the company that can merge violence, software comfort, and connectivity into one system without obvious compromise. That is why the cabin matters. Inside the 001 FR is wrapped in Alcantara and forged carbon fiber, creating an environment that still feels expensive, deliberate, and performance-focused, without falling into the cold sterility that some modern EVs mistake for sophistication. The sport bucket seats are aggressively shaped to keep occupants locked in place under heavy lateral load, but they are still designed to preserve the premium expectations of this segment. That balance is important, because Zeekr is not building a toy. It is building a global statement product. Then comes the digital layer, and this is where the car starts to reveal how far the integration goes. Powering the infotainment and the digital cluster is Qualcomm's Snapdragon 8295, chip 1 of the most capable automotive processors used in a production vehicle. That matters because in a car like this, lag is not just annoying. It breaks trust. A performance machine that responds instantly in acceleration, braking, and torque delivery cannot afford an interface that feels slow, confused, or behind the moment. The digital system has to move with the same confidence as the hardware, and Zeekr clearly understands that. The dedicated track mode developed with input from Kimi Räikkönen reconfigures the interface around the needs of real performance driving. Instead of just showing decorative graphics, it turns the screens into a working performance dashboard, live telemetry, tire temperatures, motor status, lap timing. In other words, the software is not there to impress passengers. It is there to support the driver when the car is being used the way its engineering suggests it should be used. Then the story takes one more futuristic turn. The 001 FR reportedly includes a built-in satellite communications module, allowing the car to maintain emergency communication or send a distress signal even in remote areas where normal cellular coverage disappears. On the surface, that sounds like a side feature, but in the context of this car, it reinforces a bigger point. Zeekr is thinking of the vehicle as a connected technological platform, not just a fast object. And that is where the threat to the old guard becomes even more uncomfortable, because for years, legacy automakers were able to separate luxury performance and advanced software into different strengths with different compromises. The 001 FR is trying to collapse all of them into one machine. If it succeeds, then the badge on the hood becomes less important than the total intelligence of the system behind it. And this is where the Zeekr 001 FR stops being just an engineering story and becomes a market weapon. Because the real target here is not only lap time credibility or internet shock value. The real target is the pricing logic that has protected Europe's performance elite for decades. For a very long time, the industry operated on an assumption that most buyers simply accepted. If you wanted the highest level of speed, sophistication, and prestige in one machine, you had to pay a brutal premium for a legacy badge. That premium was treated as natural, almost inevitable. The Zeekr 001 FR attacks that assumption directly. Look at the traditional benchmark set. Cars like the Porsche Taycan Turbo GT have every right to be respected. They are serious engineering products from companies that know exactly how to build fast machines. But once you move into that upper European performance tier, the pricing escalates fast. Add the right packages, the right braking systems, the right performance options, and the numbers begin pushing far beyond what many buyers would consider rational. The badge, the history, and the mythology all become part of the invoice. That is where the 001 FR becomes deeply disruptive, because Zeekr is not entering the conversation with a slightly cheaper alternative that asks customers to lower their expectations. It is trying to offer something much more dangerous to the old order hypercar level power, highly integrated software, serious chassis, hardware, aggressive aero daily practicality, and a luxury cabin all wrapped into one four-door shooting brake that undercuts the old prestige formula. And that changes the emotional logic of the purchase. If a buyer can get comparable shock performance, stronger technology integration, and far more usable packaging without paying purely for European legacy, then the old guard loses one of its most powerful weapons, the belief that its premium is automatically justified. At that point, the battle is no longer about who has the richer history. It becomes about who is delivering the more advanced total system right now. That is why Geely and Zeekr pushing the 001 FR into global markets matters so much. This is not a symbolic domestic flex meant only for local headlines. It is a rolling international argument, a statement that China's new performance industry no longer wants to sit adjacent to Europe's elite. It wants to challenge, undercut, and eventually replace parts of that hierarchy altogether. And if that strategy starts working at scale, then the real story of the 001 FR will not be that it is shockingly fast. The real story will be that it helped expose how much of the old premium performance world was being propped up by history margin and badge power long after technology had already started moving elsewhere. So in the end, the Zeekr 001 FR is not just another fast electric car chasing headlines with a wild power figure. That would be the easy interpretation, and honestly, the lazy one. What makes this machine important is the way all of its pieces are being assembled into a much larger argument. A fully independent quad motor system, carbon fiber wrapped rotors, silicon-carbide inverters, direct oil cooling inside the motors, a structurally integrated battery platform, Formula One influence in the chassis tuning, serious brakes, functional aerodynamics, high-speed charging, a luxury cabin backed by powerful computing and deep software integration. None of those elements matter in isolation as much as they matter together. Because together, they say something uncomfortable for the old guard. They say that the era when legacy prestige alone could justify massive premiums is beginning to look fragile. They say that engineering authority is no longer guaranteed by geography. And they say that the next great performance benchmark may not come from the same European strongholds that dominated the imagination of enthusiasts for generations. That does not automatically mean the old kings are finished. Legacy brands still have history, refinement, motorsport credibility, and enormous technical depth of their own. But the Zeekr 001 FR makes one thing impossible to ignore. The gap is no longer protected by myth. Now the real question is whether the world is ready to accept that. Is this quad-motor hyperwagon the new benchmark for high-performance EV engineering? Or do the traditional European names still own the crown when everything is measured beyond raw numbers? That is the fight this car was built to start.